From Manila to the globe, this is World Newsfeed, bringing you the biggest stories shaping our times. Good morning, I'm Raine Musñgi. Let's dive into the headlines making a global impact. Armed opposition groups opposing Syria's Assad regime continue their assault on Aleppo, seizing control of the Al-Nairab military airport Monday. The armed groups, which have been clashing with the regime forces in the north of the country since November 27, continue to advance in the east and southeast of Idlib. The militants are also said to have captured the residence of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in Aleppo. Following the start of operations by anti-regime armed groups against Aleppo, Syrian regime forces lost control of large areas in a short period. In response, they sought support from the PKK-YPG, allowing the terrorist group to gain territory. The Syrian regime began handing over control of areas to the east of the Euphrates to the PKK-YPG forces. The head of Syria's main opposition abroad says the ceasefire in Lebanon last Wednesday allowed them to launch their campaign to seize Aleppo. Speaking from his office in Istanbul Monday, Hadi al-Bahra said the insurgents were able to seize the city and parts of neighboring Idlib province so quickly, in part because Hezbollah and other Iran-backed fighters were distracted by their conflict with Israel.
A year ago, they started really training and mobilizing and taking it more seriously. And it was supposed to happen, according. If you ask any kid in the, in the area in Azaz or in Jarablus, ask him, he'll tell you, yeah, we are going to go and free Aleppo. And this is like 6 months ago. But the operation was delayed to the crisis in the area, and especially at the end due to the Lebanese, the Israeli-Lebanese war, where the people and commanders on the ground, they saw it's not good to have it while there is a war in Lebanon. So the moment there were a ceasefire in Lebanon, they found that the opportunity is good for them to start.
The Syrian government said its military was working to secure a string of towns it recaptured from rebels that run along the front line north of Hama, a city lying between Aleppo and the capital Damascus. The video released by Syria's military is said to show tanks and army vehicles arriving in North Hama as troops chanted pro-Syrian slogans. They also launched airstrikes on a civilian tent in the Idlib countryside, killing at least 3 people. Support from a Russian airstrike has also hit a hospital in Idlib, killing 2 others. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has vowed to crush the insurgents. Tehran has pledged to aid his government and hundreds of fighters from Iran-backed Iraqi militias that have crossed into Syria to help.
This is our land and our pride. Anyone who goes outside of the law, anyone who has been hired to stand against us, we will make an example out of him.
Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan said he hoped the instability in Syria would be concluded with an agreement in line with the demands of the Syrian people. Speaking at a press conference, Erdogan also said Ankara was closely monitoring developments in neighboring Syria and taking the necessary measures to prevent harm to Turkey's security. The Turkish military has bases across its southern border in Syria, had heard of the armed group's plans to seize Aleppo, but made it clear it would play no direct role.
Our greatest wish is for Syria's territorial integrity and national unity to be preserved, and for the instability that has been going on for 13 years to end with consensus in line with the legitimate demands of the Syrian people.
Weighing in on the conflict, the U.S. State Department said on Monday it wants to see a political process to end Syria's civil war. The insurgents are a coalition of Turkey-backed mainstream secular armed groups spearheaded by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, an Islamist group that has been designated a terrorist outfit by Turkey, the U.S., Russia, and other states.
So in the immediate term, what we want to see are de-escalation and protection of civilians and minority groups. But our overall policy remains the same, is that we want to see a serious and credible political process to end this civil war once and for all, with a political settlement consistent with United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254. As you know, Sean, that resolution calls for a process facilitated by the United Nations where the Syrian regime and the opposition groups would negotiate a path forward for Syria. It's important that that path be Syrian-led and that have a process that ultimately leads towards elections. That's what we want to see over the long term, but in the short term, we want to see a de-escalation of the situation and protection of civilians. Nothing has changed with respect to our policy. Assad is a brutal dictator with blood on his hands, the blood of innocent civilians inside Syria, blood of his own people on his hands. Ultimately, what we want to see is a political process forward where the Syrian people get to determine who their leaders are. As I said, United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 called for such a process. The Syrian government has never participated in that process. We continue to call on them to do so. We continue to call on all countries to use their influence to push forward that kind of political process that would lead to a path forward for the Syrian people, where the regime engages with opposition groups. We also believe it would be helpful if Russia and Iran stopped their destabilizing influence inside Syria. We have seen them continue to destabilize the situation going back more than a decade now, continue to play a role that is unhelpful not just to the Syrian people, but to the broader region.
The U.S. State Department also considers the ceasefire in Lebanon to be broadly successful, that despite continued exchanges of Israeli strikes and Hezbollah attacks. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller told reporters at a regular news briefing Monday that Washington and Paris would engage with the Israeli and Lebanese militaries to look at reports of violations and deal with them through channels and the mechanisms set up in the agreement. This comes as militant group Hezbollah fired into disputed border zone held by Israel after multiple Israeli strikes inside Lebanon since the ceasefire took hold last week. Israeli strikes in Lebanon in recent days have killed at least 4 people and wounded others.
We obviously anticipated that there might be violations because anytime, or nearly any time, you have a ceasefire of this nature, you have either claimed violations of the ceasefire, especially in the opening weeks when things are very fragile, or you have real violations of a ceasefire. So what we are doing is engaging through this mechanism to look at all of these reports of violations of the ceasefire and deal with them through the channels that the mechanism set up, and that's what we'll do over the coming days.
U.S. President-elect Donald Trump vowed that there would be hell to pay in the Middle East if hostages held in the Gaza Strip were not released prior to his inauguration. During their deadly 2023 attack on Israel, Hamas-led militants captured more than 250 people, according to Israeli tallies, including dual Israeli-American nationals. Roughly half of the 101 foreign and Israeli hostages still held incommunicado in Gaza are believed alive. In his most explicit comments on the fate of the hostages since his election in November, Trump said on social media that if they are not released by January 20th, quote, those responsible will be hit harder than anybody has been hit in the long and storied history of the U.S. Well, U.S. President Joe Biden landed in Angola for a visit focused on a U.S.-backed railway project and on the legacy of slavery. The visit fulfills a promise to visit sub-Saharan Africa during his presidency and aims to bolster the Lobito Corridor project, which links resource-rich Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia to the Angolan port of Lobito on the Atlantic Ocean. Partly funded by a U.S. loan, the Lobito Corridor would make it faster and easier to export critical minerals toward the United States, which has been widely seen as a way to divert some of those resources from China. At stake are vast supplies of minerals like copper and cobalt, which are found in Congo, and are a key component of batteries and other electronics. China is a top player in Congo, which has become an increasingly concern to Washington. Biden's national security spokesperson John Kirby said Biden would unveil additional commitments to the project during his visit, as well as to health, climate, and clean energy programs. During his two-day visit to Angola, Biden is scheduled to meet with President Joao Lourenço and Zambian leader President Hakainde Hichilema, and to tour the National Slavery Museum and various facilities in Lobito. The White House said on Monday that President Biden pardoned his son Hunter in part because of concern his political opponents would continue to persecute the younger Biden in the future as a growing chorus of Democrats and Republicans criticized his decision. White House spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre on Monday defended the president's action and said Biden believed Hunter faced further grief from adversaries without naming them, and suggested it could continue even after the president left office. Jean-Pierre was among the White House officials who had repeatedly said in the past that Biden would not pardon his son. But an analyst says Biden was well within his constitutional power, but is pushing the norms of the use of such powers. He noted it doesn't help his legacy for Biden to have gone against his past commitment not to pardon his son, that doing so undermines confidence in the justice system at a time when President-elect Trump has threatened to politicize it by prosecuting his political opponents.
He's not in direct legal peril for any of the events that the Republicans have been complaining about, because the pardon itself is quite sweeping and covers a substantial amount of time. So in that sense, I think it does give him immunity, really. On the other hand, I think if the Republicans really want to go after him, what they could find is a justification to subpoena him to testify about some of those events, or about events relating to Ukraine and his relationship with Ukraine, accuse him of lying and bring perjury charges. Because of the fact that he's been pardoned, he can no longer claim the Fifth Amendment, because he can't incriminate himself. He's been pardoned. And that puts him at risk of this sort of perjury trap.
First Lady Jill Biden unveiled the White House's holiday decorations on Monday with this year's theme, a season of peace and light. Now, as the Bidens prepare to depart the White House next month, Biden made no comment about the pardon of her son Hunter by husband U.S. President Joe Biden, and simply thanked the volunteers from across the country who helped decorate the White House. As part of her Joining Forces initiative to support military families, the First Lady invited National Guard families to be the first members of the public to experience the White House holiday decor.
It's been the honor of our lives to serve as your first family. May our nation be blessed with peace and light this holiday season. Merry Christmas, happy holidays. We love you all. Thank you.
There are 83 Christmas trees adorning the White House and thousands of feet of ribbon, ornaments, and hand-cut paper peace doves used to decorate the White House. The White House expects nearly 100,000 people to visit during the holiday season. Coming up next, a look at the shakeups around the world, political in France and Georgia, and one rocking the entertainment scene. Stay with us on BNC for your World Newsfeed.
Ito po si Father Nono.
Ako po si Father Fiel Pareha.
Ako si Risa Singson Kaupeng.
Kape at pandasal na po tayo. Ito po si Cardinal Chito Tagle.
Meron na po ba kayong initial findings sa drug war probe ng Quadcom? Pwede o dapat nang umpisahan yung preliminary investigation? Gaano po ba kalagana pa mga pogo sa bansa? Mukha po talagang mas malala pa yung gulo ngayon, pati kasi ang Iran ay nambomba na rin. Kayo ho ba ay kontento sa naghatol ng Manila RTC? You feel that justice has been served?
Get the latest on the economy and the financial markets.
We got a really big push during the pandemic, but since then, how has it been? Now, fundamentally, and given the anticipated rate cuts, where do you see the PSE index headed if either Trump or Harris win?
Down to each basis point.
12.75 billion peso deal to modernize the Lagundingan International Airport, a move that's expected to boost Mindanao's economy.
Basis Points with Mikey Orel. Weekdays, 9:30 a.m. on BNC. At BNC, 12 noon doesn't mean break. But breaking news, biggest stories, and latest updates.
The International Monetary Fund urges countries to implement fiscal tightening policy. Authorities raided a pogo hub just hundreds of meters away from the Senate building.
Mai Rodriguez, Newsfeed at noon on BNC, the Bilyonaryo News Channel.
Welcome back to World Newsfeed. The French government is all but certain to collapse later this week after far-right and left-wing parties said they will vote in favor of a no-confidence motion against Prime Minister Michel Barnier. Barring a last-minute surprise, Barnier's fragile coalition will be the first French government to be forced out by a no-confidence vote since 1962. President Emmanuel Macron, though, is in Riyadh Monday meeting with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. He appointed Barnier, the European Union's former Brexit negotiator, as his new prime minister just in September, after tumultuous weeks of drawn-out talks following an inconclusive snap election. Barnier struggles to get the 2025 budget through a deeply divided parliament, threatened to plunge France into its second political crisis in 6 months, underlying the instability that has taken hold in countries across the EU. If Barnier's government fell, 63% of those polled said they would be in favor of Macron resigning. RN leader Marine Le Pen said her party would table its own no-confidence motion but will also vote for any similar bill by other parties.
Nous déposons donc une motion de censure et nous allons la voter parce que les Français en ont soupé.
Obviously, faced with this umpteenth denial of democracy, we will censure the government, and Michel Barnier will probably go down in history as the Prime Minister who had the shortest term as the Prime Minister of the Fifth Republic. We will vote the no confidence and, contrary to what the Prime Minister was saying just now, there will be no chaos after Mr. Barnier and his government leave. What we are experiencing today is political chaos due to both Mr. Barnier's government and Emmanuel Macron.
Personnellement, ça m'inquiète pas trop parce que je me dis que
Personally, it doesn't worry me too much because I tell myself that, without taking a position, you reap what you sow, because Emmanuel Macron appointed a minister who was not chosen by the French people. Obviously, appointing a minister from the new Popular Front was very complicated given the current climate. It's not necessarily what people really had in mind. But what is certain is that the will of the French people, neither on the right nor on.
The opposition now has 24 hours to put forward a no-confidence motion. The vote could take place as early as Wednesday. No French government has been forced out by such a vote since 1962. Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakidze on Monday ruled out the possibility of talks between the government and the opposition, which has boycotted the parliament and backed street protests. Georgia's pro-EU president, who is locked in a standoff with her own government over the country's direction, appealed to European countries on Monday to confront what she described as a Russian attempt to impose control on her nation.
No negotiations. We remember the deadlock negotiations from 2021, then we were forced to leave the constitutional framework. Of course, the opposition does not have any resources for this today. Our proposal is open for public discussion. As we have seen, there is interest from specific people, and these days we are ready to sit down with them in a public discussion format, but there is certainly no basis for any negotiations.
Protesters gathered in Tbilisi for the fifth consecutive night on Monday to rally against the government's decision to suspend talks on joining the European Union and calling for elections. Georgian law enforcement was seen using water cannons to disperse the protesters demonstrating in front of parliament. At least 56 people are feared to have been killed following clashes between fans and a stampede during a soccer match in a town in southeast Guinea. A video on social media showed hundreds of people running through the stadium grounds in an apparent attempt to escape the earlier crush. Some reports indicate that events unraveled following a decision by the referee, who sent off two players from the visiting team, Labe, and awarded a controversial penalty kick. Prime Minister Bauri vowed an investigation, paid tribute to the dozens of people killed, and promised a full medical and psychological support to all those injured. Meanwhile, Malaysia and Thailand are experiencing a second wave of intense rainfall and possible flooding this week, as announced by authorities on Monday. Despite some displaced individuals being able to return to their homes, the most severe floods seen in decades have begun to recede in certain regions. Over the past week, 27 fatalities have been reported, and more than 500,000 households in the two neighboring Southeast Asian nations have been affected by the heavy rain and floods, which officials describe as the most devastating in many years. According to government data released Monday, conditions have improved in several areas, with water levels decreasing. In Malaysia, the count of people in evacuation centers fell to about 128,000, down from 152,000 Sunday, according to the Disaster Management Agency's website. The European Union's Copernicus Climate Change Service says 2024 is on track to be the hottest year on record and the first to exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. In 2023, global temperatures reached an alarming average of 1.48 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, and this year could surpass 1.55 degrees. Nearly 200 countries have committed to the Paris Agreement to limit warming to close to 1.5 degrees Celsius as much as possible. However, scientists predict we will likely cross the threshold by the early 2030s. Carbon dioxide emissions from burning fossil fuels are the main contributors to global warming. The data was released ahead of the UN COP29 climate summit in Azerbaijan, where countries discussed increasing funding to combat climate change. Now, under current policies, the world is on track for a temperature rise of 3.1 degrees Celsius this century. Finally, sad news in Hollywood. Music legend Elton John told a theater audience in London on Sunday that he had lost his eyesight. The 77-year-old star, famous for Rocket Man, Your Song, and a string of other hits, was in London's West End for the opening of Devil Wears Prada musical, for which he wrote the score. In an emotional speech from the stage of the Dominion Theatre at the end of the show, he said the performance sounded good, but he had not been able to watch it. Elton struggled to recover from an eye infection earlier in the year. He thanked his husband, David Furnish, for being his rock. And that's all for now. Thank you so much for joining us. Catch up with us again tomorrow at 10 when we bring you The World in 30 Minutes only on World Newsfeed. Follow the Money comes next. Keep it here on the Bilyonaryo News Channel. Always on time.